Now, our next design was sent in by Betty Scott, and Betty Scott lives in a beautiful part of the British Isles. She lives up in the Stirlingshire area of Scotland and not far from Loch Katrine, which is this particular embroidery design is showing. Betty writes to me, "Thank you for setting this challenge and making me think of doing something different. I have never done colour mixing to this extent, only small amounts as part of a bigger design. I found it fairly straightforward and did some colour blocks as you suggested. This stitch out is actually the second one I did, as I was not happy with the first. This was mainly due to the clouds in the sky, as I felt the first lot did not look right and altered the design, so that the dark colour for the clouds was put under the top layer rather than right on top." Yeah, you use undershading. It's the same as you would do with if you were doing watercolours. Undershade colours. You know, you put the darker ones underneath and then you put your washes on the top. With threads, it works in a similar way. The scene is Loch Katrine, which is only a few miles from here. The grey skies are typical. Now, they're not grey, Betty, they're silver. Come on, sweetheart. I like Scotland, mainly because I lived there for a short while as a child, in Edinburgh first, and then up in Openen, which was just a wee bit above Alt Bay, but below Ullapool, and my mother lived there for the last 40 years of her life. Okay, so your design. This is the view of Loch Katrine. Now, this is the kind of sky I like. I like to digitise these. They're interesting, they're busy, and I like to use the loose density for doing them. But don't try doing big chunks. I just do little bits. That way I've got more control over where travel lines go, and for instance this particular sky, that's a wedge of white just there, and it's actually above the grey. The grey is closer to us than the white is, and you can see over on this part of the loch, and it's the farthest away from us, it isn't part of this one, it's another hill. In fact, looking at this, let's move you over. Bring this down a touch. No, it's too pixelated now. That even looks to me as if that might be the top end of the loch up there. And this lump rising here is more landscape, covered in mist. And you can see this is another hillside further away, just there. And look at the colours in here. Purples, what I would call dead olive tree branch colour, olives, grey olive colours. There's loads and loads of clumps of warm dark umber. Anyways, I'm getting away from the point. When you look at the photograph, the first thing that struck me was there's no reflection. No reflections at all. So that means the sun is well and truly covered up. You're getting UV light, but you're not getting the clean, clear sky that would give you the perfect reflections of the islands in the water. And when you look up here, because they are so far away from the eye, you're not aware of if the water's choppy or not. Well, it must be, because another thing that breaks up reflections is choppy water. And then I get the sensation that there's quite a strong breeze blowing, because all the ripples are coming in across the loch with a slight twist in that direction. You see that? You've got the twist in the water, but it's actually flowing from the top corner down to the bottom corner. You've got this area of really bright water here, with just flecks of darkness from where the ripples, the shadow of the ripples. You've got this very still looking water up here. I shouldn't imagine for one moment that it's still, because it's purely the distance that it is away from the eye. And then over here on these hills, definite areas of woodland with velvety green patching in between. No woodland, just that velvety green. You see? You've got the slope, and the slope isn't regular. This one actually slopes in that direction. This slopes in that direction, and it's a bit steeper up there than it is here. And you can do all that in loose density fills, but you have to do it in small pieces, not great big long sections of it. A wee bit like I said in one of the earlier videos, painting by numbers, only in this case painting with thread. Now, you said you've only ever done colour mixing on a small scale. Colour blending is great. I love doing it. I did it for 40 years as a free motion embroiderer, and I started at about age 15. I stopped doing it when my wonderful old machine died after 40 years worth of hard work, and discovered that my Janome NC 10,000 couldn't do it. It would scream at me, raise your feed, dogs. Your feed needs to be raised. That was it. And of course I didn't want to raise my feed. I wanted to be able to move my hoop every which way that I wanted to go, thank you. I didn't want it dragged through. And no matter how hard I tried, the machine argued with me so much, I gave up. And that's when I started wondering, could I do it with the software? And my first few experiments were dodgy. I mean, really dodgy. But I persevered and I experimented, and I had a lot of fun. I don't even know what happened to the first few experiments. I think they got used as dusters. But they weren't up to the same standard as I was used to on my old Singer. But I kept plodding away, convinced that one day I'd be able to do it inside of my digitizing program. And it took me some time to work out what I needed to be able to do, because of course digitizing loose density isn't the same as actually doing it free motion. You don't have to worry about alignment. You don't have to worry about start and stop points. You can go off and do what you want to do wherever you want to do it. In the hoop, if you use a hoop as I do. And that was the other thing. I was used to doing naked needle free motion embroidery. The machine wouldn't let me do naked needle when I tried to do my free motion embroidery. It refused point blank to work. I had to put a foot on. And the foot obscured a lot of what I was doing. But I suppose if you're not experienced at doing free motion embroidery, the temptation is to stick your finger down close to the needle to smooth an odd bit of fabric out of the way or something. And that's when it's dangerous. So you get impaled. Fortunately, I've never been impaled, mainly because I had a tutor when I was at art school, when I first started doing free motion, who insisted I learned how to manipulate a hoop. So I knew no ways that you put your finger inside the hoops. And of course with machine embroidery, you don't have to worry about that because the machine does all the hoop movement. Okay, so let's look at your design. I love cloudscapes. I like doing them. I'm not always happy with the results, but I don't make big shapes. I would break up, say, actually this dark shape. When I look at the photograph, that doesn't exist. There you've got a lovely band of white and just a receding band of pale blue-grey. There is no big area of grey. There's area of grey up here, But I would have broken that up as well into smaller areas to make them more controllable. Because even doing it as a loose density, you still have to stay in control. Exactly the same as you would do if you were doing free motion embroidery. You break things into smaller bites. I hope you've watched the other videos, because you'll see that I mentioned the use of pieces of thread that you've trimmed off of your embroideries, or when you've changed your threads on your machine. You save them all. You don't throw them away, you put them in a Ziploc bag or something, and you just keep collecting them. And they come in dead handy, because if you've got the right collection, you just put a little bit of spray adhesive on your background, you sprinkle them, and then you use a loose density catch down stitch over a top film. So you make a sandwich. Top layer of dissoluble film, then you sprinkled on threads, yarn, Angelina, and then your base fabric. But it does mean you've got to be very accurate with your placement, because you have got to go in then and digitize a very open weave fill to hold those in position. Okay, now part of doing loose density designs is you have to loosen up. Now, I've spent the last, since 2005, 10 years telling everybody to tighten up. Watch your fill angles, watch your overlaps, watch your tensions, trim as you go along if you don't have auto trims, travel between objects, because I wanted everybody to learn the basics. But of course, when you've got a constant influx of new members, it gets boring for those who've handled the basics and really need to move on. Part of moving on is experimentation and loosening up, because once you understand the rules of overlapping and underlapping, fill angles, travel lines, digitizing to minimize trims, then you can break the rules. And that's what loose density digitizing does. It breaks the rules. And you can experiment as much as you want, because there's no right and there's no wrong way. Okay, now I opened up your design and I wondered why, when your photograph gave such a beautiful stainless steel colour, you'd not used it. And then I realised you'd mirrored the shape of this down here, but there's no reflection. There's no reflection in your photograph. The weather isn't clear enough, but you've put one in. You haven't created this flow. What you've done is you've used a Florentine effect, and it does look lovely and your colours are nice, but it doesn't give me that sensation that the water is being, or there's a wind rather, coming down the lock and it's pushing the water ahead of itself, creating these ripples which are making curves, but the curves are travelling in this direction. They're not going up like that, they're going that way, because the water's being forced along the lock. And then I noticed this, capsiosis, and I double checked to make certain that you'd used densities of 1.3, and you had, although using Florentine over such a big area will cause pull. You'll get the push down or the push out over here, you'll get the pull down up here and here and here. This will push out, and I looked at your stitch out and there was the gap. So then I checked your sequence. You put your water in after you'd done the land, and it came up over the land. Now you could have changed the sequence so as you land, your heels are stitched after the water, and moved these things. the nodes. Move the nodes up onto the land. Then you wouldn't have got this gap. But it's a brave attempt. I'm glad you tried it. It does show that you're not afraid to use the effects. But this is such a beautiful photograph. And that's, as I said, I love skies and I love the water. You know, that area of real brightness here. The purple you used for your hill is almost identical to the purple that's in this water. But you've made your water bluey green. And one of the things you have to watch, and it's one of the things that I used to use when I was teaching. So I would set children an exercise to do, and I would say, draw what you see. And out of a class of, say, 30, only one child would draw what they saw. The others would draw what they knew. They would know that water is blue or green. So they would do a picture with bluey green water. They'd draw a chair where all the legs were equal length. They'd draw a table where you saw all 4 legs, because they didn't understand perspective. But there would always be at least one child in the class who would do their best to draw what they saw. They had freed themselves from a belief in what they knew to start seeing things as they were. And that's what we need to do when we're doing things like this. You've got to bring in experimentation. You've got to find ways to show the texture on this hillside and get your skies in. Now, plain blue sky, yeah, that's boring. This isn't boring. This is fantastic. There's so many colours in here. You've got to be able to see beyond a standard embroidery digitizing. So watch the other videos, carry on playing with colour blending. But don't go for such big shapes. Break the shapes down. Right, I have to move on now. As I said, I'm glad you sent this in. I'm glad you had a go. I hope you enjoyed doing it. Right, I must move on.